number 9. I'm actually reordering my initial plans for this class. I had originally thought to cover the book of Ezekiel in lesson 9, but upon reflection, it made more sense actually to just skip Ezekiel altogether and go straight from Daniel to today's topic. Daniel is going to come up in Matthew 24, and then in the next lesson, we'll get to the book of Revelation, where Daniel will come up some more in some of the chapters. So it just made more sense to me to kind of keep the train of thought from Daniel to the passages that reference Daniel. So today, Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is significant because it is Jesus himself addressing at length the very questions we're trying to answer. But there's some other information mixed in. We have to be careful about how we read that. The first thing I want to point out about this text is the setting, that it really does matter to know where they are and when they have this conversation. We are standing, if you're standing next to Jesus at this time, you're standing in Herod's temple, or sometimes called the Second Temple. Matthew 24, verse 1 says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Okay. So the original temple was built by Solomon back like 1000 BC, roughly. And then it's destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. It's rebuilt about a century later in the times of Nehemiah, Ezra, and those fellows, Haggai, Zechariah. But it wasn't as grand as Solomon's temple. In fact, the book of Haggai says people wept when they saw the new temple because it wasn't as fantastic, because they were refugees coming out of captivity rather than Solomon, immensely wealthy. They just couldn't build it back brick for brick like it had been with his wealth and prosperity. So they did the best they could, and in some part were disappointed. Through the years, then, there were some renovations and expansions to the temple to kind of make it more significant, the biggest of which had begun under Herod the Great and began about the time of the birth of Christ, about the end of the final millennium BC, about that time, and had continued. It's about a 70-year project that continues about midway point when Jesus is an adult. So in this passage, it's not quite done, but in large part, it's well underway and really impressive. They expand the Temple Mount itself. They actually make the hill bigger so they can add more space to the court around the temple. It's a massive and elaborate structure that really adds to the beauty of it. And they build a Roman fort up Antonia, overlooking the temple so the Romans can keep an eye on things if they got into trouble down there. Okay, so the Jewish people are really excited about the way the temple is shaping up. And that's what the temple's spectators here, the apostles, are saying to Jesus. Hey, look, isn't this grand? To which Jesus responds in verse 2, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. You have this huge source of national pride, and Jesus just throws a wet blanket on it and says, it'll burn. It's all coming down. And the disciples are just distraught about this. So they wait until they've left the temple. And in verse 3, they have some questions for him. The questions are going to be really important for us to understand what he's trying to answer. They're thinking, when they look at this, what is our master saying? It's very controversial. He just stood in the most important building in our world and said, it'll burn, it'll fall. So at verse 3, on the Mount of Olives, which is outside Jerusalem, kind of looking out at the temple, the disciples came to him privately. They want to ask this question in public. They come to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Tell us, what do you mean by this? It's all going to fall. How can that be? Important thought here, though, that I want you to notice. The disciples assume that when Jesus says the temple will fall, well, that must be like the end of the world. Whenever the temple falls, that must be the end of the universe. It would be like me saying the White House will burn and you saying, oh, you mean like the country's going to fall? And that's kind of what they're thinking. The temple's going to fall. You mean like the world ends? Is that what you mean? And so they ask, when's that going to happen? When does this new temple fall? And is that at the end of the world? When's that going to happen? Jesus doesn't necessarily teach that those two things happen at the same time. Remember, the temple had already fallen once in 586 BC. That's why they had to rebuild this one. So it's entirely possible that the temple would fall, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. And I think that's the point he's going to make. So the first answer, and I think we have to listen, Matthew 24 is a very difficult chapter. There are passages I'm actually going to skip here because they're difficult and I'm not entirely sure I understand them. I'm going to hone in on the ones that I feel like I can understand. But what I think you can see is that there's two different answers being given. On the one hand, Jesus says the temple's going to fall, but then he's later going to say, but that's not the end of the world. The end of the world will look like this. And that's the point he's making. So part one of the answer starts in verse 4. He says to them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So what does he say? To your first question, when are these things going to happen? When will the temple fall? He says you're going to hear all kinds of rumors. You're going to hear people claiming to be the Messiah, but they're actually false Christs. You're going to hear wars and rumors of wars and political intrigue, famines and disasters. He says, but that's just the beginning. I mean, we haven't even got anywhere near the end yet. He says the end is not yet. So this part, he's not talking about the end of the world. He says, when you hear this, you're going to think, oh, the world is ending. He says, oh, no, we're not even close. That's not what's happening here. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. So again, he says, things are going to get bad, persecution and violence. Many will fall away. False prophets will come. But then listen to 13 and 14. The one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. So what does he say? When you hear these bad things happening, that's not the end. He says, no, the gospel's going to live on. I think there's an assumption in this passage that he means like as soon as that's over, then the end comes. But that's not what he says either. He says, terrible things will happen. The gospel will live on. It might live on for years. And then someday, the end will come, but not right away. And not just because, I think the point is making, not every time things get bad should you assume, it's the end of the world, because there's going to be a lot of bad days. In particular, here he says the endurance was needed, right? Just be patient, he says. The gospel will go on, and then someday, yes, the end will come, but it doesn't happen every time you have a bad day. In verse 15, he gives us a clue about what he's talking about immediately. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, pause there, let the reader understand. He says, what is he saying? He seems to be quoting or alluding to a couple of passages in Daniel, one of which is Daniel 11:31, which says, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, to be fair, I don't think Jesus and Daniel are talking about the same actual historical event, but I think they're describing the same thing. Daniel was saying in his prophecy that the temple would be defiled. That happened more than once. Jesus is saying it's going to happen again. The same kind of thing Daniel talked about. You're going to see it one more time. You're going to see the temple defiled. Jesus is referencing a cryptic prophecy of Daniel regarding the profaning of the temple in Jerusalem. And he says, you're going to see that same thing that's happened in years gone by happen again. The temple will be profaned or defiled by pagan Gentiles, presumably. And he says that's a sign that bad things are about to happen. Not of the end of the world, but that bad things are about to happen. What should you do when you see that sign? Here's what he says in verse 15 to 20. Then, when you see that, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. Alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Now look at those instructions for a minute and think about them. When you see this happen, flee to the mountains. If it's the end of the world, the whole story of humanity is coming to an end all around the world. Everything is ending. Christ is judging everybody eternally. Does it make any sense to go hide in the mountains? That makes no sense whatsoever. He says, don't go back home and grab your coat. Why do you need a coat at all? If it's the end of the world, yeah, you're not going to have time to get your coat. But you might be tempted to get your coat if something bad was happening that he's talking about. Hope you aren't pregnant. Again, if it's the end of human history, being pregnant is the least of your concern. Hope it's not winter. Well, again, if you're running for your life from an army, winter would be bad. If it's the end of the universe, winter doesn't matter. Hope it's not Sabbath. Why would that matter? Well, again, if something bad is happening in Jerusalem, they kind of closed down the city on Sabbath day. The gates would have been closed. So if it happened on a Sabbath day, something bad happened on a Sabbath day, you were kind of stuck in Jerusalem. On some other day of the week, maybe you could run and hide. So I think when you look at these statements that he makes, what you get is this. None of these instructions make any sense for the end of the world. Go hide in the mountains makes no sense. But all of these instructions make sense if something bad was going to happen in Jerusalem. And I think that's the point that he's making. He's saying, you're asking two questions. You're asking, when does the temple fall and when's the end of the world? He's saying, well, they're not the same thing. The temple will fall, and when that starts happening, you should run because you're in trouble. But that's not the end of the world. The fall of Jerusalem happens historically, we know, in the year AD 70, under the siege of Rome from the Romans. Luke describes this in a parallel passage in Luke 10:20 through 24, where Jesus is saying basically the same thing in Matthew 24, only in Luke's account. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. Not those who are out in the country enter it, for these days are of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against his people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What's he talking about? There it's really obvious. He says, this is going to happen when armies surround Jerusalem. Okay, in AD 70, get out a history book, the Roman Empire gets kind of sick and tired of Jewish rebellions, and they come down to Jerusalem. They surround the city. Some of them are standing on the very Mount of Olives where Jesus is making this prophecy, and they siege and burn Jerusalem and defile and trample the temple. Several of the passages that Jesus mentions now specifically seem to tie into that. Listen to, for example, Matthew 24:21 through 22. For then, again, at that time, whenever this happens, there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. It's going to be really bad, Jesus said. If God let it go on indefinitely, it could have been cataclysmic. It was bad enough as it was. When would these things happen? Listen to verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Whatever he's talking about cannot be something that we're still waiting on today, because he says people alive right now will see it. He's speaking in about 30 AD. Fall of Jerusalem is about 70 AD, 40 years later. He said this generation won't pass until it's done. Listen to the historian Josephus, is a significant Jewish figure. The Romans grab him up and take them with them as they siege Jerusalem, and he describes the events in one of his writings. He says, as the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. It's a fun word. Passion alone was in command. Crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled by their friends. Many fell among the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as the defeated. As they neared the sanctuary, okay, so he's describing now the army entering the temple. As they neared the sanctuary, they pretended not to even hear Caesar's commands and urged the men in front to throw in more fire. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, we're right in the temple at the altar. The heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. Okay, what Jesus is describing actually happened. He says, this temple's going to fall. And the disciples say, you mean at the end of the world? He says, oh no, long before we get to the end of the world, this temple's going to fall. And it's been recorded in history for us. The Christians at that time remembered what Jesus said and took it very seriously. Christian historians tell us that when the Roman army approached the city, like Luke said it would, like Jesus said it would, Christians began to leave because they remember their Lord saying, this is going to get bad. Epiphanius says, all the disciples went to live in Pella because Christ had told them to leave Jerusalem and to go away since it would undergo a siege. Eusebius, a few centuries later, says the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they call Pella. To it, those who believed on Christ traveled from Jerusalem, so that when holy men had altogether deserted the real capital of the Jews in the whole land of Judea. So what are they telling us? The Christians actually believed what Jesus said. They took this to refer to the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. And when they saw it coming, they left town. So they understood this. Now, at the second half of Matthew 24, Jesus seems to change the subject. Not completely, because remember, the disciples had asked two questions. They said, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? So the first thing he says is, let me tell you about when the temple will fall, and it has nothing to do with the end of the world. Second, he says, now let me tell you about the end of the world. Verse 36, but concerning that day and hour, see, not this one, that one, concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. And then he compares it to the flood of Noah. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, it's going to be a big event that's going to take the world by surprise, just like the flood did. Verse 42, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. See the comparison in those two passages then? The first half of chapter 24 says it's a local destruction. You're going to see it coming. There's going to be lots of warning signs, and you should run away when it happens. It's going to happen in your lifetime. The second half of the chapter, he says, it'll be global like the flood of Noah. There's going to be no warning time. No one's going to see it coming. There's nothing you can do about it except wait and be ready. It'll happen at an unknown time. He's talking about two different things. One was in their immediate future. One was down the road. He's correcting their misunderstanding. They thought, whenever the temple falls, that must be the end of the world. He goes, no, the temple's going to burn soon. With my coming, the coming of the second coming, the end of all things, is still down the road a ways. You and I are still waiting on it today. But the temple was burned 1900 years ago. So final point then, what do we do with this information from Jesus? Okay, the temple already fell, again, 1900 years ago. That one doesn't help me much. He says the day of his coming, he's not going to tell us. It's just going to happen. Listen to what he says, verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. The wise servant, he says, is just ready all the time. Whenever Jesus comes, the wise servant is ready to go. He's not waiting for warning signals. He's not worried about watching the news to find out when it'll happen. If it happened right now, wise servant is ready. If it happens 100 years from now, wise servant is still ready. The fool, though, is different. If the wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He says, if you decide not to be ready, if you say, well, the master's not around, Jesus hasn't come back yet, and act a fool, he says, that's the day I'm coming back, and you'll pay for it. So the moral of this story is not read the newspaper and wait for the end times. The moral of the story is, yeah, bad things happen. Not every bad thing that happens is the end of the world. The temple fell 1900 years ago. The world's still standing. You should be ready, though, in good times and bad, because someday it is all going to end. And when it does, you want to be ready for your Lord.